This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 56. Laissez, Faire, Go Mate.
Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and the title of this episode, Laissez, Faire, Go Mate, which is probably lost on those of you who are not of an Australian extraction. But of course, part of the Aussie psyche is ensuring a fair go for all. So does that come from small government freeing up the opportunity for everybody, or does it come from big government ensuring everyone has access to the same education and the same competitive advantage? Two very different propositions. Laissez-faire economists believe that market forces are the best way of running the economy, that if the government gets its hands into it, it'll probably stuff it up, so less regulation is a good thing, and that people and companies should basically be able to do what they want. So I guess there is a point that one thing worse than a laissez-faire economy is one where the government does get involved and does all the wrong things. After all, laissez-faire is French for leave alone. And look, Steve, that was pretty much the argument, wasn't it, of Adam Smith, that market functions best without the government because human nature is so diverse and the consequences of government policy are so unpredictable that how can the government really know what's in everyone's best interest? So the best thing to do is to leave it to, and I'm doing the air quotes, the quotation marks around the invisible hand. Leave it to the invisible hand, close quotes.
Yeah, that was not just Adam Smith's view. It actually came out of the French physiocratic school to some extent. I think it was Mirabel with the, what's it called, the fable of the bees, which was the idea of private virtues and public vices, and which is the opposite. Private vices and public virtues, pardon me. So the idea was that everybody pursuing their own self-interest led to a better outcome collectively, whereas the usual argument, and bear in mind that the laissez-faire case wasn't made in contrast to the modern state. It was made in contrast to the feudal state, which is a very, very different beast. And one element of the feudal system, which we don't have any experience of these days particularly, except in the old days of international trade, is that the main source of revenue, apart from self-sufficiency in feudal manses or feudal fiefdoms, feudal estates as they were called, was to tax merchants as they went through. So even if you weren't going to that particular king's or a particular lord's realm, you're going to trade at another realm, you get through the gate, you had to pay taxes on the way.
Right.
And it was enforced in a rather polite fashion. Basically it's a knife at your throat. Highway robbery, but highway robbery done by somebody who called themselves a knight rather than somebody who called themselves a bandit.
Right. So we're in effect almost acting like mini governments because we were taking taxes for our patch of land in effect.
Yeah, and one of my favourite illustrations of that was on a trip I did to Germany some years ago. We went to visit a medieval castle, and when you saw the location of the place, it was absolutely brilliant because the castle was placed at the point of a bend in a river, where the river narrowed because of the bend. And there was a cliff right behind the castle, and the castle was so the land between almost all the land between the river and the rise of the cliff was taken by the castle, and you had to walk past the most incredibly fortified system to get to the other side. And basically, whatever they wanted to charge you on the way through, they could charge you. Right. So that's the real origin of the attitude of laissez-faire.
So you're saying it perhaps works in those times because times were so different because you could do that sort of thing. And yet, Margaret Thatcher, she wasn't quite in feudal times, but she harked back to Victorian values. And I sort of know when you start to use Margaret Thatcher in an argument, that's a bit like using Hitler in an argument, isn't it, really? You've possibly already lost.
Yeah.
But she referred to Victorian values. She was harking back to a time when the state had little influence, there wasn't much tax, people were able to stand on their own 2 feet, and the economy supposedly prospered. And perhaps because of that laissez-faire approach, that did encourage the industrial revolution in Britain rather than in Europe. Or is that a load of hogwash?
It's both. There's an element of hogwash and an element of truth to it at the same time. And I think people realise who follow me on my blog and have seen my debt deflation page, one of my favourite economists of all time is not an economist. He's a applied mathematician called John Blatt, who wrote a book called Dynamic Economic Systems. And it's out of print, but I believe that if you search on my website, you might find a link to it, because I think it's one of the great neglected books. One of the patrons, by the way, paid me a lovely compliment saying my book's one of the 5 best books of economics of all time. Well, I regard John Blatt's as one of the 5. And I've made it available there for anybody to take a look at, because being out of print I think is a travesty. I'll do my best to get it in print when I have time to do that sort of stuff in the next few years. But John made the point that forget about the feudal origins of the laissez-faire attitude. Let's take a look at how laissez-faire, when it actually to some large degree operated, because governments in the 19th century were roughly 1/5 the size that they are now compared to GDP at the time.
Yeah.
And of course there was no welfare. The welfare was handled mainly by charities. There was some degree of government regulation, but generally speaking it was let it rip. And what he said, what you got out of that was a 19th century trade cycle. There was a financial crisis about every 10 to 15, maybe 20 years at most. Bearings collapses, there were about once every 10 to 20 years. John does a good job of documenting that in dynamic economic systems. So what you got out of it wasn't stability. You got these very dramatic booms and busts. And of course, some of them almost led to communist takeovers of little countries like England at the time, because when the collapse occurred, there was a massive increase in unemployment, and that was a good rallying call for socialists opposing capitalism. So it's one of those cases, be careful what you wish for. It might not work out the way you think in your little hypothetical model of a world without government interference.
But wouldn't it also create an understanding of risk, which, if we intervene, then we reduce that understanding of risk, because we remove the events that are based on risks, so we bail out farmers after a bad harvest, for example, so they don't put money away to protect themselves for the next time it happens. That could be the counter-argument to that, couldn't it?
Yeah, in this case, that's one reason that I'm not... I see a little bit. I'm going to be having a bit of a fight with the MMT crowd in the future, so let's be a bit more frank about this sort of thing. There are elements of delusion, I think, to the MMT view. The government always does things better, but there's a role, or the government always does things well. Rather, there is a role in which the government getting in the way sometimes encourages trends that wouldn't be there otherwise. And there's much more to talk about than just this, but one thing which struck me when looking at the data assembled by the Bank of England after the 2008 financial crisis, they did this beautiful piece of work of saying, what can we learn from 300 years of financial data? So they went back to their old books, quite literally, and went back and produced a set of long-term data series they hadn't had beforehand. And one of them took the level of private debt, not as far back as I'd like it to be taken back, but back to 1880. Previously, their record stopped in about 1960. And frankly, this is Jeff Tilley was the statistician responsible for this at one stage, only because of my prompting, and Jeff agreeing with my arguments, did the English statistician have a series of private debt in the first place. Anyway, that's by the by. When you look at the data, you see that between 1880 and 1920, and equally in America between 1834, which I've got synthetic data from 1834 until 1917, you see that there was there were plenty of booms, otherwise positive credit, but plenty of busts as well of negative credit. And in the UK's case, that meant that looking at private debt, not just from 1880 right out to 1980, in fact, there was never a level of private debt like we see now. So what happened was the government coming in and stopping a boom turning into a bust, turning into a huge financial crisis, meant that level of private debt continued to accumulate. Right. So there's some ways in which the government's intervention has encouraged a build-up of speculative excess we wouldn't have had in its absence. So that is an argument in favour of saying, well, maybe the government goes a bit too far. But there are other elements to this argument about, free trade, a free competitive market nirvana that equally have holes in them.
Well, I guess one of the big holes is, can companies and economies go too far if it's, is it self-regulating? So, for example, if we look at a corporation, if we don't have regulations in place, does the corporation start to act too much in its own interest against the interests of society? But there's a counter to that as well, isn't there? If a corporation steps out of line, don't people just stop buying from it?
The part of where the government evolved from in America was the behaviour of what are called the trusts, because what happened as well during the 19th century is the formation of large companies, not just the small competitive stuff that's part of the Austrian vision of a perfect world, but aggregations forming where companies forced together by the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and groups of that nature, forming a monopoly of some particular area, for example, rail transport, and then screwing the farmers and the workers in the process. So one of the ways in which the robber barons, as they were known, and the railroad barons as well, one of the ways they accumulated their fortunes was knowing where they wanted to put the railway lines as they went through the west of America. They would go ahead of the rail being established, terrorise the local towns, buy up the property cheaply, and then run the railroad through, and of course make a fortune on the increase in depreciation of the value of the land. And you had similar behaviour in wheat. With I don't know that detail as clearly, but they certainly ended up trying to bankrupt the wheat farmers. Quite awful behaviour, in other words. And one of the things that I find about a lot of Austrian writing about what it would be like in a pure market economy, it's sort of, so we're going to have these nice capitalists who don't do nasty things to each other or to the workers. I'm sorry, that is a fantasy. And you get the let's use a technical term. You get the assholes turning up and ending up with a world in which they can cloak their walls with platinum, which is literally what the Vanderbilts did, at the expense of bankrupted farmers back in the Wild West.
But isn't there? I mean, surely you can create some form of legislation. I know that the moment you start talking about that, then you're going, yeah, it's the laissez-faire ideal. But if it's causing harm to other people, then surely that's easy to say, well, that has to be against the law. That's a different thing to the market working for itself. If you are doing something which is deliberately causing damage to other people, then surely that's illegal.
Yeah, but I think because you've got to have, how do you enforce it? Now, Milton Friedman would have private and literally did actually argue in favour of private police forces, where you'd pay for your own police force to enforce your laws. Therefore, the person who can pay for the biggest police force wins. It just doesn't. We have to have something which attenuates. And here, my analogy is that we may have gone overboard with it, but I see the government as effectively an air conditioning unit, in the sense that you've got a private system which is actually extremely volatile, huge ups and downs in both economic activity and the legality and otherwise of behaviour. And what the government does is an institution that operates in the opposite direction because it's not motivated directly by profit, whereas the private sector is. And that is not in itself a bad thing, but you will have, if the private sector gets into a slump where it's over-borrowed, over-boomed, assets are becoming worthless, they de-invest, all the trends are negative, and therefore you're going to go into a slump. The government spending operates like an air conditioning unit. When the room gets too cold, turns on the heat, and you get a certain balancing coming out of it. So there is that side of the role of a government is ignored by the Austrian fanboy types of the world.
But I mean, that's a very binary reaction from that air conditioning unit, isn't it? If the room's too hot, it makes it cold. If it's too cold, it makes it hot. I mean, do we know enough about the economy to actually be able to say, well, we're going to do this, it's going to have that effect?
Well, this is where, again, there's a good argument that Koleski made about the inability of planners to be able to respond as rapidly as necessary. So he was in favour of what was called under the so-called Keynesian period, automatic stabilisers. In other words, you have things which are built into the economy just by things like, for example, unemployment benefits that mean that when there's a downturn because of a slump and workers are being sacked, then there's an increase in cash flow through businesses because those workers get unemployment benefits, which they otherwise wouldn't get. Now, one of the reasons we're getting a more dysfunctional state these days, and something which people are then arguing in favour of going back to deregulation, is a systematic decision to undermine those automatic stabilisers by things such as saying you only get unemployment benefits 6 weeks after you lose your job. Now, that's pretty tough for the worker, but it's also tough for a retailer, because once that worker's lost a job, there's 6 weeks of slumping sales. So how's the retailer likely to act in response to that? Increase their own cutbacks. So these sorts of things, there's ignorance about that attenuating role. And to some extent, because we have governments dominated by a lot of people who believe in this myth of a world that would work out better without the government, not the saying it works perfectly with, by the way, but saying it will work better without, they've deliberately weakened the state in those ways, which partly comes back and supports their own argument, apparently.
But there is But there is the idea, isn't there? I mean, I'm sure you've made this point in one of these podcasts before, that we really don't know how best very often to intervene. If we're a government, if we do something, there could be unknown consequences. So we could be making matters worse, couldn't we?
Yeah, we can. But I think we've got the 19th century as an example of what can go wrong with a pretty close to pure free market system. And let's go through some of the elements that exist there. Firstly, there's the robber baron developments occurring, and you have to have a police force, you have to have laws, you have to have political power being able to impose against that sort of behaviour. That's where the antitrust legislation from America came from. Another important part of it is that, and I see this and I look at it and I think, I just can't see how people don't see their own fallacy here. But a lot of Austrian-style economists and Austrian fanboys are in favour of private money, and they say that what you should have is a bunch of private banks all creating money. Yes, these are the ones who accept that banks actually do create money, and what the public will do is they'll choose the more responsible one. Pardon me, but bullshit. Because what happens is the public, when they've had the choice of these private banks, and they did exist in the 19th century America and to some extent 19th century Australia and New Zealand as well, the public chose the ones offering the highest apparent returns. And what would happen, of course, half of these were Ponzi swindlers who'd make off with the money. So there'd be a boom and a crash and subsequent witch hunts trying to find the people who ran off with the money and so forth. So the part of the vision they have of this private money working better, and the concept they put forward often is that you'd start off with a whole bunch of private suppliers. Some would be honest, others would not. The dishonest ones would be driven out of the market. Only the honest ones would be left, and everything would be nice and stable. With anything like that, there'd be booms and busts, and people would forget the past wildcat behaviour and go back and with the next one who was offering a fantastic return. After all, Charles Ponzi occurred in Boston, which you can hardly call a backwater of America, in 1919 to 1922. So the people's capacity to fall for a swindler never disappeared. So the idea that you'd have a stable private money system and well-functioning markets, I think, is just another set of delusions.
But it sounds to me like what you're saying is that to try and prevent a laissez-faire economy from misbehaving and getting out of control, there's got to be some sort of mechanism to try and stop people misbehaving in whichever way, through whatever loopholes they find. You've got to close those loopholes. And then I guess the other element is you've got this this potential for rich-poor gaps, which you've got to try and correct as well. Are they the two key elements that you need to keep control of, or is there more than that? Because it seems like today there's a lot more than that the government's involved in. Yeah, well, that's also a question of what sort of resources do you want to have managed fundamentally for profit versus those you want to have supplied no matter what. So the key ones there end up being massive utilities like power, sewerage, and water, because in those cases you don't want power to be available 23 and a half hours of a day with a random distribution of when the power goes off. If that happens for an aluminium smelter, it's goodbye aluminium smelter. So there are some particular services you do not want to be motivated by short-term profit, and pretty much that's my area where I'd say, okay, I'd rather have the state provide that at the minimum possible cost, rather than letting private providers get inside there with an incentive to go for short-term profit, and also quite frequently to cause some of the financial volatility on the markets. We all know the story of Enron to some extent. People have forgotten it already, I would think. But Enron actually managed to cause some of the blackouts in California to help its own profit levels, because it could then supply the power much more expensively from the sources it had outside California. So there are ways in which you get really quite robber baron behaviour developing in the private sector. It isn't all about making a profit in a nice, responsible way. And yet some would argue that, places like Australia and New Zealand and like Switzerland, possibly some of the most laissez-faire economies in the world, are thus far some of the best performing economies in the world.
Oh, come on. How do you call them laissez-faire? I mean, they laissez stuff up.
But I mean, but you look at in Australia, for example, mind you, Australia does have a big public sector, I guess, but I mean, it does try and involve the private sector in all its public sector stuff. You know, I mean, there's a very much an attitude, isn't there, of the market's got to drive things as far as Australia's concerned.
And that's where the NBN comes in, which has been a total catastrophe.
Absolute
rather than
disaster. Yeah, completely.
Yeah. Rather than just a simple state provider providing a cable to the premises, which was the original idea of Mike Quigley. I think you know Mike Quigley, don't you?
Yeah, I don't know what's happened to him, but yeah, I did know him.
I know him as well because he happened to be my wife's boss, my first wife's boss in Alcatel. I had immense respect for him as an engineer and a manager. And he's now out there sniping at the NBN because it's turned into a disaster by Malcolm Turnbull and his mates, first of all, trying to undermine the Labor Party just by putting forward any alternative to the Labor Party's idea at the time, but also undermining the idea of what the engineers wanted to have of having the cable going straight to the house. And now, of course, they've got competing private groups competing to provide the services to the houses rather than having a national provider.
Right, but it's an interesting example, the NBN, because, and you know, I'm sure some laissez-faire economists would argue that it should all have been done by the private sector. And you know what? I might actually be one of those who argues that way because the initial decision was so anti-competitive. It was sort of like, well, the government is going to deliver this network and we're going to do it at the expense of any investment from the private sector. We're even going to close down private assets like cable networks that already exist because we don't want to have a competition. We want to have a government monopoly. So that was an example of perhaps the government overstepping the mark. And you look in the UK where they're streets ahead. I mean, don't have the best broadband in the world, but they are streets ahead of Australia because you've got competing players who are wanting to roll fibre down our street. I live in rural Surrey, and BT and Virgin Media both want to run cable down our street.
I'd rather have one cable than two competitors down the same cable. We've had competitive travesties coming out of forcing doubling and trebling of infrastructure where it's not necessary. My picture on this front of the best example of a combination of state and private is what the South Korean government did, because they basically told their telecommunications companies, we don't care how you do it, but you've got to collectively provide T100 cable to every house in the country.
Yeah.
If you want to continue operating here. So your licensing depended upon that. And they basically got together and built, you know, a more than world-class infrastructure, out of which evolved firms such as Samsung. So there's two dimensions to it, I think.
There is. I mean, even on that, and sorry to interrupt, there's another dimension to that story as well, which is that legislation there was that if you had people in a tower block, then the power for that tower block needed to be provided by the telephone company. So they had the problem of how did they provide electricity for copper wiring to distribute into tall buildings, and the cheapest solution very often was to use fibre because it's passive. It doesn't need powering along the network. So actually, it was a commercial decision very often. The cheapest way of providing access into those tower blocks was to whip out the copper and use fibre. So that was actually the big driving force, I think you'll find, in South Korea.
That's interesting. Again, that shows that was a good outcome, both a sort of combined market and state outcome.
Yeah.
But
how do you get the balance right is the question, isn't it?
There's the trouble with a lot of economic argument is that it goes for one extreme or the other. You get the, on the right wing or the left wing alternative, absolutely no government or 100% government, and I rather like the yin yang position of Asian philosophy, that there's a balance between the two, and we need to realise that's the case. So if you look at the private banking, wildcat banking, unregulated, etc., did not work out to eliminate the bad banks and just have the good ones. It gave you booms and busts and rapacious behaviour. Not having the government there led to the formation of quite exploitive monopolies. They're literally the robber barons of the 19th century that made themselves responsible by establishing appear responsible by establishing wonderful beneficial trusts in the 20th century with a fraction of the wealth they'd accumulated. And you have provision of services, which in some cases it's just better to have the biggest institution in the country doing it, because the economies of scale are so vast you want to have it done on a grand scale. It will be cheaper than the private sector competing with multiple infrastructures, and you also want it provided in such a way that it's 100% reliable. Reliability is more important than price. So there's all those various factors, and I think out of that you can say, well, there is a need for a government sector. If you did without it, and this is the point of the podcast, of course, what would you have? Well, you wouldn't have equilibrium in the market. You'd have booms and busts, with financial bubbles being caused by speculative behaviour and people rushing to Ponzi schemes offering enormous returns, which would then, of course, plunge you into a crash later. You'd have unemployment being quite high to the stage we'd have political unrest, almost leading to a call for socialism. But you'd also, and this is the other side of it from my point of view, you probably would not have the same accumulation of private debt as we've had in the 20th century. That's a clear difference between the 19th and the 20th. After the formation of large government and after the Second World War and the Great Depression, there has never been, up till the 2008 crisis, never been a period of massive negative credit. So it never wiped out the accumulation of previous booms.
And is that because of this whole risk thing that I mentioned earlier, the fact that if we're stepping in too often, we're removing this risk and therefore this debt builds up?
It's also partly because politicians don't like... so if a downturn occurs and it's a pure market system, there's nobody to blame. But if we have a political system where the government has a substantial impact upon the economy, they get the blame, and it suits them to be causing the economy to appear to be booming all the time. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to encourage a private sector bubble. So there is an element to which every time there's a downturn, you encourage the private sector back into speculation again. Now, that's not what the government's supposed to do. If you look at the ideal MMT argument, it's supposed to stop that sort of behaviour. In fact, it can actually encourage it, because that's one way the politicians make themselves look good.
Yeah. So are we saying au revoir to laissez-faire then, or do you like that? Or are there elements of the thinking that we should hang on to? It is getting the balance, isn't it? How do you get the balance right? Because obviously there's elements of the laissez-faire economy, pure economics, that we want to make the most of. But we would need the government as well.
On that front, I like a lot of the work done by Mariana Mazzucato at one end of the spectrum and Bill Janeway at the other. They're very compatible, but one argues that the government does a lot of innovation by being able to afford to waste money on things like NASA programs. So that's the local Currawongs helping out. By the way, have you heard that in the background? The government encourages innovation through projects like NASA and even DARPA. DARPA is what gave us the internet. So there's innovation coming out of the government's capacity to create money and waste money and not worry about it. And then venture capitalists fund innovation because they also can afford to waste money and generate innovations like computers in the very first case and so on. So there's a blend of roles between the two, and we have to get the balance as close as we can to right. But certainly at the moment, what we've done with the preventing collapses with the scale of government spending, maybe we've encouraged a number of speculative bubbles which have gone on far longer than they would have done without a private, if the government had been smaller.
Okay, we'll leave it on that point. Very good. Thank you, Steve. By the way, awful line, your Aussie broadband. There we are. It's a demonstration. We've heard how bad it can be without the right government investment.
It really dropped off, did it?
Oh, it's been a bit shaky, but we just about heard you. Anyway, catch you next time.
Okay.
Steve Keen, who is on holiday back in Sydney right now, and he's going to be there for our next podcast as well. Hopefully we get a better line. Again, we're going to look at a fairly rudimentary topic next time. Is economics a science? We criticised neoclassic economics in a recent edition when we were looking at post-Keynesian economics, and some criticised Keynesian and post-Keynesian economics for exactly the same reason. So, in fact, is any economics a science? And if not, could it ever be? We look at the broader discipline of economics and an important one to listen to next time on the Debunking Economics podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.